Um, so we were left off yesterday with the November election, or last time we're together, of 44, right? So, Dewey being defeated by FDR, not a big shocker there. I told you the major question, of course, going into that election was, would FDR survive a fourth term? And I say that because I'm going to show you a picture in a few minutes, and you're going to be able to see this absolutely difference in his physicality, his nature. So one of the things your book doesn't mention, but I like to throw in, sort of maybe in the margin, you want to write this or something, is that during World War II, the Germans were really on the vanguard of military development. They're the first country to develop rocketry. Rockets are an enormous deal. Ask Elon Musk, and they're at the vanguard of this. They're developing these new rockets and they're launching them into Britain. So these are, when we think about what a rocket is, these were launched. These were surface to surface rockets. They would go and fly across the English Channel. The first ones were called the V1, and they started those in June of 44. Interestingly enough, right about the time of D-Day, and they made a noise. You could hear them coming, so people could actually have time to take cover a little bit. They buzzed. They made a sound. So they were called the buzz bomb. And what's really fascinating to me as we get to the Manhattan Project here in a few minutes is that this is what the Germans had decided to fully develop after 42. Up until 42, the Germans were actually seriously considering atomic energy as a weapon. And Hitler had finally killed the idea. He said that, I don't want, but that's science fiction. So what they had done is progress into the area of missiles, of rockets. And so what's really interesting to me about the end of World War II is Germany is occupied by the Americans, the Brits, and the French, and the Soviets, right? And so you're going to have a mad dash by the Allies to capture German scientists for their knowledge, all right? And this guy down here, Werner von Braun, all right, is one of the founders of NASA. And he was a German rocket scientist. That's literally what he did. And so we're going to get the best rocket scientists out of Germany at the end of World War II. And this will help lay the foundation for the later space program, obviously. So the use of these rockets are not enough to turn the tide of war. Like they're definitely a significant event if one blew up your house in England. But, this is not a major offensive weapon during this period. So Hitler's kind of down to desperate measures. Keep in mind, by 44, a German U-boat launched some of these guys, these rockets. Okay. I knew that there were Japanese attacks in Oregon of like balloons, and I think a couple subs made it to San Francisco or one of the harbors. But I didn't know there was a German boat in New York, or sub in New York. Interesting. Yeah, well, that's a good point to mention also, is that at the end of the war, America physically has not been in any way really seriously damaged, right? And everywhere else in the world is decimated just about. So that's interesting. I'll have to check that out. So by the winter of 44, the Americans have progressed across Northern Europe. So what I want to show you is, if you go back to after D-Day, we call this the breakout, right? So after D-Day, Patton's army comes in, his tanks come in, right, and sweep across France so quickly, they actually run out of gas. They run out of fuel. They get ahead of the fuel resupply. So they have to wait for the gas to catch up. So by the winter of 1944, our soldiers have made it through Belgium, okay, and are on the German border. So if you come over here, you'll know that there's a thing called the Rhine River, right? They had tried another paratrooper assault in Holland. What Eisenhower had wanted to do was actually get behind the Germans, sever their ability to move backwards, and kind of cut them off. And that's where the name of the book and movie, A Bridge Too Far, came from. We got too far ahead of our own supplies and stuff, and we had to actually retreat because we'd overextended ourselves. But that was a slight setback in the fall of 44. By the winter of 44, we are on the border of Germany here, and the Russians are on the border of Germany here. They're in Poland, okay? So at this point, Hitler has entered full desperate mode. Now, there are several really fascinating movies made about this period in history, one of which is about the last year of Hitler's life, and it's called Downfall. And it's in German, but if you can ever get your hands on Downfall, it's narrated. The story comes from one of Hitler's secretaries, his personal secretaries, who witnessed the events of Hitler's bunker in Berlin during the last year of his life. And it's really fascinating because Hitler was plainly delusional. Like at this point, Hitler was commanding armies that didn't exist. He was ordering generals to do actions which were utterly impossible to do. But the last thing he did do that was sort of reasonable was an attempt to sue for peace by forcing America's hand. So what he wanted to do was to take. So it's winter of '44. All right, it's December. In fact, it's almost Christmas time, and we have done so well that most of our soldiers have been given a R&R, a relief. They can go back to Paris or even go to London and relax for a little bit for the Christmas holiday. It's heavy snow in Belgium, and the thought is that this will be sort of the winter downside of the war. When people kind of take a break, right? So Hitler sees this, and he says, okay, well, there's an opportunity here if I mass all my troops, all my German, Wehrmacht and SS that are left, into one big offensive. I can break through the American line and reach the port of Antwerp, which is where we had a lot of supplies for the U.S. military. And then he said, we'll cut off part of the American army and British army, and then ask to sue for peace, knowing that we can then say, we'll help you against the Russians, knowing America and Brits don't like the Soviet Union, right? So that's Hitler's strategy. He wants to smash through the American line, which is much thinner at this moment because of the holiday, and make it to the coast and then sue for peace. Got that? So he smashes. He sends tank divisions, artillery divisions, all that he basically has left. The bottom of everyone that's got left, who's not holding off against Russia, into our lines, and the lines get smashed into, and all around this little town called Bastogne, right here. You see that? All around this little town, American troops are retreating. These are fresh recruits from America who've just been brought over to kind of plug the line during the winter. And they're like, the German army is coming at them, and they retreat. Well, while they're retreating, our most decorated unit is ordered into Bastogne. So here goes our guys, and another group goes back into it. And they don't land in Bastogne, but they are those paratroopers who landed behind enemy lines on D-Day. So you remember that when that happened? They're the 101st Airborne, and they're ordered into this little town right here, right? And so the Germans, and by the way, this town is so important because it's 5 roads converge on it. It's a crossroads. So you can't move troops or personnel without moving through this town, right? It's crossroads. So the German army swells and goes around it, but they can't, they attack it over and over again, and the 101st Airborne don't break. And so they're getting frustrated because this is like the bulk of the German army against a single division. And this is, by the way, the way paratroopers who I've always been impressed with, the paratroopers I've known in my life. They're always cocky guys, but surrounded and cut off, that's the way we like to be. That's where you're supposed to be if you're a paratrooper, right? So they are literally surrounded and cut off. They've been battling in Bastogne for a month. All right. The newspapers in America are printing their story every day. The battling bastards of Bastogne. That's what they call it, right? The 101st Division is holding on to this little town while the Germans are throwing everything they can at them. Every one of these soldiers are wounded at least once. They're suffering from frostbite. They're in holes in the ground, and it's 0-degree temperature. So it's a really brutal winter battle. So finally, the commander of the German army there sends the commander of the 101st Airborne. I told you about the Screaming Eagle. There's the eagle, right? You see it? They send this to the general, and he says, to the commander, the USA commander in Bastogne, you're totally circled and cut off, and we intend to, totally annihilate you if you don't surrender, right? You're going to be totally annihilated. And this is what General McAuliffe, that's Anthony McAuliffe, who was a really, really tough guy. He sends him a one-word response. Here it is. To the German commander, nuts, signed the American commander, right? Nuts is like a phrase, a term, a word back in the 1940s for like, go to hell, like screw you, So he's basically like, there you go, So that word, this story is printed, and American morale is like, yeah, we love our guys. So by January, Patton's tank army arrives. Okay, now again, this could have been a disaster because we can't use our Air Force. You understand? Now, it's really fascinating to me about the story of Bastogne and the Battle of the Bulge. So let me tell you one other thing. I like to teach local history whenever I can. So let's take a look at two local heroes, okay? And I usually don't do this, and now I'm going to start because I like it so much. So one of the stories is, I think you guys, have y'all ridden the bus out to the Institute? Yeah, I don't think you've ever had to ride the bus, but maybe you've driven on the bypass, right? And if you've ever driven on the bypass, then you have driven over a bridge that says Archer T. Gammon Bridge. All right. This is Archer T. Gammon. He was a staff sergeant. And I think I have to, I'm getting ready to get choked up here if I just think about it. So, he was from a little town north of here called Gretna, right? Well, between Gretna and Chatham. He was actually a farm boy in that area. And he's a staff sergeant during the war. He is going to, one of his unit is sort of cut off by a Panzer tank. But a Panzer tank is like the very frightening, massive Tiger tank, actually is what this one was, which can just obliterate our tanks, much less our soldiers, infantry units. So here's Archer Gammon, and what he does, I want to read his accommodation, okay, to you, because there's not too many times in my life where I get to sort of sing my praises of someone, and I want you to hear his Congressional Medal of Honor recognition. So, guys, the Congressional Medal of Honor is the highest sort of recognition any individual can receive in the U.S. military. And this is the citation. He charged 30 yards through hip-deep snow to knock out a machine gun and its three-man crew with grenades. So I want you to imagine, here's this guy running across a field of snow. There is a heavy machine gun nest posed there, and it's got his men pinned down. I'm going to let y'all see this rather than just read it to you, because it's just too much for me not to tell you about. So I'll tell you what, we'll do it this way, and I'll reformat this later because I just want you to see it. Whoop. So think about this country boy from Pennsylvania County, right? Archer Gammon. And this is his Medal of Honor accommodation, which is the highest award anyone can be recognized in America, the Congressional Medal of Honor. He charged 30 yards through hip-deep snow to knock out a machine gun and its three-man crew with grenades. So he's got a machine gun, he's shooting at a machine gun group, and he's throwing grenades into the hole where the Germans are, right? Saving his platoon from being decimated and allowing it to continue its advance from an open field into nearby woods. The platoon's advance through the woods began when a machine gun opened fire and a Tiger Royal, that's a huge tank, sent 88 millimeter shells, massive shells screaming at the unit. Staff Sergeant Gammon, disregarding all thoughts of personal safety, rushed forward, then cut to the left, crossing the width of the platoon's skirmish line. So he's running in front of where they're shooting at. And he's keeping his guys in the fight, right? So there's bullets flying everywhere around him. Intense fire was concentrated on him by riflemen and the machine gun crew on the tank, or near the tank. He charged the automatic weapon, wiped out its crew of 4 with grenades. All right, so that's a second machine gun he's taken out. Okay. And with supreme daring, advanced within 25 yards of a Tiger tank, like singularly. Like think of this massive vehicle with, huge guns on it, and he's running at it. All right. Killing 2 hostile infantrymen with rifle fire as he moved forward. The tank had started to withdraw, backing a short distance, then firing, backing more, and then stopping to blast another round when the man whose single-handedly relentless attack had put the machine on defensive was struck and instantly killed from the tank's heavy gun. He was shot with an 88 millimeter shell. That's what you use to blow up like a house or big trees, right? By his intrepidity, his lack of any fear, and extreme devotion to the task of driving the enemy back, no matter what the odds, Staff Sergeant Gammon cleared the woods of German forces, where the tank continued to withdraw, leaving open the path for the gallant squad leader's platoon. So that's this guy from right here in Pennsylvania County, just north of Chatham. And I feel like it's absolutely essential. Now, they call it Roanoke County if you look it up, but he wasn't from Roanoke County. He was actually from Chatham and lived north of Chatham. He was enlisted in Roanoke. That's why that's on where he was from. But definitely, I want you to know this guy's name. If for any other reason, when you think about people who died for your freedom, this is one of them right here from this county. Okay. Now, the other fella, and this is a bizarre story if you've ever heard of it, is a guy who actually sat in the same desk as he did with him. So he was a classmate of his, right? And his name was Clyde B. East. All right. He was a lieutenant colonel. Let me see a picture of him here. This is Lieutenant Colonel Clyde East. He is going to shoot down 2 German planes on D-Day, right? He was one of our very first Americans to join the Air Force of Canada. And then on D-Day, or by D-Day, he had switched to the American Army. And he will shoot down more German planes than any other single pilot in World War II. And he was a classmate of Archer Gammon's. And so on the day of the death of Archer Gammon, this fella, Clyde East, was flying over the battlefield. So here you had this guy from our county, Chatham, fighting on ground, and this guy from Chatham who knew him flying in the air right above him, and was this highly decorated soldier. He's literally, if you look up aces of World War II, like the flying aces of World War II, he is one of the most decorated. At one time, he had a Guinness Book of World Record for most shoot downs of any pilot that ended in in Vietnam, when you had all these helicopter battles, but he was a true ace. And so I take the time to talk about him with you guys because, you never know when an extraordinary person is going to emerge. He was from Shiva. That was that little town, that little zip code they called it back then. So please, just for your sake and mine, if you're ever asked about heroes from our county, here's Lieutenant Colonel Clyde East, and he only recently passed away. In his 90s, he was working at the Reagan Library in California when I actually had a chance to talk to him. So that's kind of cool. Like, he was still an active person in military and in history. And this is Staff Sergeant, what do you call that, Archer T. Gammon. So definitely be aware of that. Okay. Medal of Honor recipient. That's what that special decoration is right there. And a very, very elite group of people that are decorated with that. So it's during this, it's during this period that after Patton breaks out and meets with the 101st, we're then going to cross into Germany. We're going to cross the Rhine River. Okay. So once we're in Germany, it's the first time that we see this. I think Band of Brothers is currently on Netflix. It's an HBO series, but it's on Netflix now. You've got to watch it. Definitely watch episode 8. It's called Why We Fight. And in that battle, or in that movie or series, you will see the Americans liberate a Holocaust concentration camp for the first time. And so we had kind of known, the ground soldiers didn't know at all about the Holocaust. Remember, the Americans who were in government kind of knew about what was going on, but the average grunt on the field had no idea that. And so they come across these camps. Now, I will tell you this, just for your sake. So here's the German, here's the Belgian border, and here's Germany's western side, right? And so these western camps, so if you're looking at 3-11-4, so Bergen-Belsen, 4 is Buchenwald, 12 down there is Nathweiler, and 13. So these are the kind of the western ones. These are not the mass extermination camps. And it kind of makes sense when you think about it. They're in Western Germany. There are people nearby, like German people nearby. I mean, this is like in neighborhoods and stuff. So these were work camps where you worked until you died from starvation. But these weren't the crematoria massive camps that are in the east. The Russians are going to liberate places like Auschwitz, for example. And if you look here, you'll notice that the worst camps were in Poland. So when the Germans moved eastward into Europe, Poland and Russian territory, that's where they did the bulk of the Holocaust there, far away from the ordinary German citizens, where they didn't have to look at it, right? Or worse, have ash made out of human skin falling on their car or their house. wouldn't want that inconvenience, right? So definitely be familiar with the fact that we are going to liberate some of the camps, and the Russians are going to liberate the biggest outfits, particularly. So it's during this that the one of the things I really love about Eisenhower is he had, Eisenhower lived in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He was from Kansas, but he lived in Pennsylvania at the battlefield, actually. And he had a great sense of history as a general. And so when we went into these death camps, these concentration camps, he first ordered that the German people had to sort of clean them up. The German people had to pay witness to what they had done. Like Germans are brought in to dig up the people and bury them properly and to fix the problems that they did. So that's one of the things that Ike really wanted to do, is make German citizens see this. But the other thing he did is he had it filmed. He had it filmed because he knew that there would be people who said, "What? Didn't happen, right?" Well, it did happen, and it's documented. This is not some sort of trickeration by the Jewish people, And so Ike wanted to preserve this crime evidence because he expected that there would A, be a trial, which there will be, and B, that people would deny it. And that's definitely been a reality too. So I give him credit for recognizing that. And so, we were absolutely stunned at what we discovered. People who starved to they were on 400 calories a day and working all day long, like 16-hour days. So this was death through work, right? Starvation. And here you can see, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the great Jewish writer, historian, and key civil rights figure, Elie Wiesel. He wrote a great series of books, but one of them's called Night, which was about his experience as a person in the Holocaust. And he was used as a slave at Buchenwald. Here you see they would bring in bulldozers to have to bury all the corpses that they found, in one big pit so that they wouldn't cause diseases. So it was an absolute astonishment. But the title of that episode is called Why We Fight. And it's because while there are times in American history where we're not always the good guys, I believe that, we've made mistakes, but this is what pure evil looks like, right? This is evil. And very rarely do you say you're fighting a war against evil. And this is one of them. This was an evil deed done by a lot of people, carried out by a lot of people. And so I think it's important that you recognize that the Americans, when they discovered the Holocaust, it began to give them another reason why they were fighting the Germans. Because remember, the Germans didn't attack us officially, like Pearl Harbor. There have been subs attacks and stuff. But up until this time, I think most Americans and German, heck, a lot of the German soldiers, well, not a lot, but some of them had even lived in America. So, there was some sort of camaraderie there. But now, this was like, oh my gosh, they had done this. It's mass murder. Okay, so this is, I think, in any normal U.S. history class, I'd spend more time just making sure you knew who these people were. Like, know their name. This is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. His name is Churchill, but I think you guys have it, right? So they've already met once, the big three, at Tehran, remember? And your book, for whatever reason, and I know the reason, decides not to discuss this meeting in this chapter. They're going to discuss this meeting in the next chapter, but I feel like it's essential to at least mention it some in this period because it happens during World War II. This meeting is by some historians considered the beginning of the Cold War, right? The event when the Cold War begins. It is not in this chapter. It's the next. I still want you to write it down because it occurs before FDR dies, right? And because you can see here's FDR and he looks rough. Now Yalta is in the Crimea. So if you know where like the Black Sea is, it's a resort town, really nice place in Russia, in southern Russia on the Crimean Peninsula. So it's called Yalta, and this is the second time the big three meet. And what FDR wants, and I mentioned this earlier, is to get the Soviet Union into the war in the Pacific. At Yalta, by now it's become pretty clear. By February of 45, after the Battle of the Bulge, it's become clear that the Germans are going to lose. Now we've been planning on them losing all along, but now we have to focus on what's Europe going to look like after World War II? What's the post-war world going to be? And so what FDR and Churchill want is a reunited, sort of strong Germany. Well, actually, Churchill wants that. FDR is sort of comfortable with a weaker Germany, but still, what they don't want is the presence of Soviets throughout Eastern Europe. So if you think about the map that I showed you earlier, and let's go back here and think about it, by 45, and this is the the late winter of 45 spring, this is where the Soviets are. They're on, and see, Berlin is almost in Poland. It's on the eastern side of Germany. So at this point, the Soviets are shelling Berlin. The Germans can hear the Russians coming. Got it? So, but not only are the Soviet troops there, they're all along here. So there are Soviet people, Soviet armor like tanks, Soviet infantry in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and in Poland. Right? So this is how far the Soviets have advanced. And Churchill and FDR are really concerned, like, well, can we get Stalin to pull out of those countries? Keep in mind, these are countries, right? Now they've been occupied by the Germans, most of them, but now they're occupied by the Soviets, and we don't know how to get them out of there. And so that's what they asked basically Stalin to do. Stalin's like, oh yeah, we'll withdraw from Eastern Europe. That'll happen, right? So, they're going to concede that for a while, Germany is weak. Right? At Yalta, they're going to say Germany will be divided. And for a while, however long that lasts, the Soviets will temporarily occupy Eastern Europe. And this will be a very big deal. And I don't want to talk about this too much now, since I'm going to talk about it again in the next chapter. But, the problem is that both Churchill and FDR have no way to dislodge the Soviets, short of Britain and America going to war on our ally. And they've always been sort of like tepid allies at best. Stalin just doesn't trust them at all, and he probably shouldn't have, because they didn't trust him at all. But one of the things FDR definitely argues for, and is going to get them to agree to, is a new League of Nations. Now it's interesting, a new League of Nations, because the last one didn't work, but the country that made it not work was America, primarily. So this is an interesting argument, and he calls it the United Nations. Now they don't create it, they don't make it, they don't even agree to create this thing yet. But they do agree to have a meeting to discuss making it. All right. And so that's important. So it's the idea of a United Nations. Okay. All right. So that's called Yalta. And if you were asked on a test or a quiz, what were the major wartime conferences of World War II, you would start with Casablanca, then Tehran, then Yalta, and then I'll do the fourth one here in a minute, called Potsdam. Those are the four that were relative to war planning. There are a lot of other major conferences during World War II, but those are the military planners. Okay, guys? So let's go back to the Pacific. And two things have changed in the Pacific. Well, lots has changed in the Pacific. First of all, remember, the Japanese surface fleet has been seriously wounded. After the Marianas and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, there is a greatly reduced Japanese surface fleet. Plus, by this point in the war, by 44, our submarines are now wreaking havoc on Japanese shipping. So we sink tons and tons of Japanese ships. So this is one of America's many submarines, many M-A-N-Y, numerous submarines. These are pictures taken from the periscope of sinking Japanese vessels. So our subs are just laying waste to the Japanese surface fleet and merchant marine. They're not able to travel anywhere without us sinking them. By the way, Yamamoto, remember the guy who planned World War II's attack on us, Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor? We broke the Japanese code pretty early, and in 43, we get radio word where Yamamoto is going to fly, and we send our planes out and shoot him down. So Yamamoto is actually killed in 43, which is a real big setback for the Japanese morale and Navy. We actually kill him and shoot him out the sky. But the other thing that we have started to do is round-the-clock firebombing of 60 Japanese cities. You understand? And when I say firebomb, this is a new type of bomb that's been invented. Now, keep in mind, talk about a perfect weapon for an enemy. The Japanese building material primarily is wood and paper, right? And so we're going to build these mammoth incendiary bombs that when they hit, they scorch like massive amounts of territory. 8 times as many Japanese people are going to die from incendiary bombs as from the atom bomb, right? It's far more devastating, but we don't ever talk about that. By the way, this war is the greatest war in history for the death of civilians. We kill, as countries combatants, far more, almost 2 times as many civilians die in World War II as military combatants. So we're talking about firebombings, tons of major cities in Japan. The guy in charge of it is nicknamed Bombs Away LeMay. All right, his name's General Curtis LeMay. He will later be in charge of the entire Air Force, right? But he was a one-star general at the time in the American Air Corps. And one of the quotes about firebombing Japan, he says, if you kill enough of them, they will stop fighting, you know, and that's kind of what we were doing. We were just scorching Japan into oblivion. So if you've ever wondered why Japan is like such a famously modernized country, particularly Tokyo and stuff, it's because we obliterated it. They had nothing and they had to start from scratch. And that was all post-World War II. So everything in Japan literally is modern, you know, because they had to rebuild it all, basically. Okay, so this was our two major this is Tokyo is on fire right here. The whole city of Tokyo, which is, you know, major city, is on fire. Fire bombing, that's literally what it's called. They're incendiary bombs. It's kind of like napalm, but not quite the same. You know, it's a similar effect, but it's a bigger bomb dropped from farther up. You know, it blows up and sets a firestorm out. Check it out sometime. It's a pretty awful thing. So General MacArthur had famously told the people of the Philippines that he would someday come back, right? You know, I shall return. And so here, after we went, Saipan, MacArthur is going to land in the Philippines and say, people of the Philippines, I have returned, you know, rally to me, in typical MacArthur fashion. But by the way, this is a staged photo. They did it twice to make sure that they got the angle right. All right, you know, so like MacArthur, kind of like TR, he would carry the press corps. You know, he really flirted with the press corps, knew how to get the pictures right. This guy wants to be president. Okay, and so, you know, what a great picture of him striding the shore. The beach was completely empty with like no enemy. They're all yeah, you know, but it's still pretty awesome, and his strategy certainly has worked in island hopping. But what's happened now, as we've, you know, grown closer and closer to Japan, is the Japanese military, if it's possible, has actually dug in harder. They refuse to surrender, right? This is the point by now where when the Japanese are running out of weapons or food, they will take a grenade and run into a group of Americans and blow themselves up. Or they will leap off a cliff, or they will kill themselves rather than surrender. So they're an absolutely brutal force. And we need two islands in the Pacific to have as a staging ground for a potential invasion of Japan. Let me show you where I'm talking about here. Wow, it's been a while since we looked at Japan. So if you're here, here's the main home of Japan. And right here, if you could follow my lines here, are Iwo Jima and Okinawa, right? Iwo Jima and Okinawa are the last, and by the way, those are considered by the Japanese part of the sacred ancestral home of Japan. So Iwo Jima and Okinawa were part of Japan before World War II happened, so to speak. So there's nothing on them. They're basically just volcanic mountains, but they do have runways and air bases and stuff like that. So they are going to fight an absolutely brutal resistance, refusing to surrender. And the problem is you couldn't pick a much worse place to have to fight as Americans than Iwo Jima, because the Japanese are in a mountain. They have created a mountain fortress, and they can hold it. And from that fortress, they can shell anywhere on the island. And so the island is covered in. You guys know that when a volcano erupts, the lava, when it can mix with sand and create obsidian. You guys know what obsidian is? Like black glass. So the whole island surface is like jagged black glass. You're like fighting in a glass ground. You know, it's hard though. It's not like nice like our glass. So you see these big jagged things sticking up. But even the ground itself was your enemy. And you had to fight on this mountain called Mount Suribachi. Well, finally, on February 19th, the Marines take Suribachi. And it's one of the great moments in military history, you know, because we've been fighting there for over a month. And it's just been a brutal inch-by-inch battle. The Japanese. There are two movies made by the filmmaker Clint Eastwood, one from the Japanese perspective and one from the American perspective. One is called Flags of Our Fathers. That's the American perspective. It's about the raising of this flag on Iwo Jima. The other is called Letters from Iwo Jima, and it's about the recovered Japanese letters from the soldiers who were Japanese who fought there. Really, really good pair of movies. One's in Japanese, one's in English. And excellent if you ever get your hands on it. This picture is immortalized. I've got it on, you know, my door out here on notice the poster. You ever seen it? Ever noticed? Okay. Yeah, I like World War II pictures because
Well, I haven't seen it on your door. I've seen it.
yeah, right. So, yeah, big flag down there, right? Like talking about American flag. This is the kind of stuff I care about. So these Marines are going to be told by their commander to go raise an American flag to show everybody on the island that, you know, we've won, we've got the mountains, so to speak. And so when they do, he's like, all right, now bring me the flag. You know, we're going to use it for our unit. This is the flag that flew over Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima. And so then they go to raise another flag, you know, because they're like, oh, that was a good image. And when they raise the second flag, this picture is taken. All right, there's a photographer there who snaps a picture of it. And unfortunately, most of his other pictures got exposed. They were destroyed. But nonetheless, we have this very famous image of the Marines. And this image has been used many times in popular culture. After 9/11, you will see pictures of Americans lifting a flag over the rubble of the World Trade Center, and then it looks like this kind of thing. So it's a very heroic moment. And by the way, if you get up to Arlington, Virginia, which I certainly hope you will, the Arlington National Cemetery is the home of the Iwo Jima Memorial, which is the U.S. Marine Corps Memorial. And it's this in giant memorialized form, if you've never seen that. So now the Japanese are desperate. They were desperate already, but now they're completely desperate. And they resort to this. And so this is the last island before the home islands of Japan that we need to take. And it's called Okinawa. So Iwo Jima and Okinawa are the last two major battles in the Pacific. And on Okinawa, the Navy will be fighting against the Japanese Navy. And at this point, the Japanese Air Force, which again has been hammered once we got the Hellcat, is going to just literally put dynamite, explosives in their planes. They're going to pack the planes with explosives, and the planes will become missiles. So these pilots are sadly, you know, for the Japanese side, trained to fly their plane into an aircraft carrier. And that's what they're doing in this picture you can see. So our deck gunners for our naval ships, it wasn't enough to shoot at, like to shoot at the plane. You had to blow up the plane, because even if the plane was damaged, they'd still fly it into it. And they did a lot of damage, and a lot of Americans were killed fighting for these two little rinky-dink islands. But thousands of Americans and tens of thousands of Japanese died. So we were looking at a very long, difficult war still, right? Because if we had to invade Japan, FDR was told it's going to cost us 1 million Americans. Now, not dead, but 1 million Americans are needed to commit to that invasion. Because in Japan, everybody will fight for every square inch of territory, right? So that's what we were having to deal with. But the world was stunned on April 12th to find out that President Roosevelt had died. Now, it's kind of one of those things you kind of knew was happening, but you never wanted to actually see it happen. And it happened. On April 12th, he was in the little White House, they call it, in Warm Springs, Georgia. This is the little White House. This was his retreat in Georgia, where he'd go to try to relax some. With the swimming pool for his polio, and he had a cerebral hemorrhage, which is just a blood clot in the vein, in the brain ruptures, and he died. And you know, if you look at the picture of FDR here, let me pull up a picture of him from '33, and you compare the two. It is hard to imagine a more like vigorous transformation of a person to go downhill. Now, he was always a healthy guy, except for, of course, having polio. But even after his polio, he seemed sort of a vigorous, healthy-looking dude, right? But I'm going to pop a picture in here just to show it comparison to you. Probably be massive. Yeah, you can actually see his pores. Sorry. Right. But FDR had gone from being this sort of, you know, relatively healthy, minus the whole polio thing, happy-go-lucky, congenial guy to an absolutely sickly-looking man. You know, like he was in terrible shape. So here you see before and after, right? That's what 12 years of World War II and the Depression will do to you. And what I like to tell students to do, especially in government class, we do this sometimes, is go check out before and after presidents' pictures. Like, see what look at Obama before he was president, after he was president. He could turn almost white, didn't it, in 4 years? Clinton went from being a chubby, kind of happy-looking dude to the skinny, emaciated guy who had a heart attack. You know, so there is an enormous amount of stress and pressure on that job, right? So I think about how much FDR sacrificed to lead our country. So I have great respect for that. So when that happened, you know, Truman is going to famously say, and I'm going to talk a lot more about Truman in the next chapter, but he's going to famously say when he got the call that I felt like the whole world and stars had fallen on me. Like everything fell on me there. And it was just It was so much for him to try to accept. But he was prepared for it, in a sense. He was prepared for the possibility of having to become president. Now, I will say this. FDR and Truman, while being cordial, had no personal relationship. They didn't hold joint meetings very often at all. Truman didn't conduct business with FDR typically. Today, presidents and vice presidents are almost like a team frequently, especially Clinton, Gore, Bush, Cheney. Those are guys are known for like team. I think this is a situation where Truman was brought on because he was his own man and would be able to lead the charge. And right away, Truman has to deal with the end of World War II, at least part of it, because this happens 2 weeks later. So 2 weeks after FDR dies, Hitler kills himself. He shoots his dog. He poisons his dog, poisons his wife. She willingly poisoned herself. And he poisons himself and shoots himself. And the reason for that is interesting to me is that Napoleon had tried to kill himself with poison while he was sort of down in the dumps. And the poison was weak, and he got sick in his stomach but didn't die. So Hitler was always superstitious that poison would not work and then he would be in pain. So he poisoned himself and then shot himself. It was a really bizarre situation. He kills the dog, Blondie, his German Shepherd, because he didn't want the Allies to make it like a on display, this is Hitler's dog being paraded around and stuff. So Goebbels, the head of his propaganda agency, his wife and he are going to kill their 5 children and then kill themselves. So when I tell students, when I talk to people about Hitler, the Nazis in the high command typically were like a cult. And what Goebbels and his wife said was that they could not imagine a world without National Socialism and Hitler. So they killed themselves and their 5 children rather than lose World War II. And that was not unusual for a lot of Germans. They thought, for them, Hitler was the world, and now he was dead. He and Eva Braun, this is his wife. He married her the night before. She had been his mistress for the whole war. By the way, it's really cool that Eva Braun was a fan of home movies because she has they're color home movies of her and Hitler. And it is absolutely creepy, because it's like Hitler talking to babies, like little kids, and playing with dogs and being like a normal guy, talking about Gone with the Wind, the movie, and you're like, oh my gosh, that's Hitler, so. But we have that for historians. It's like a gold mine of information. So she and Hitler are going to be carried out of the bunker and put in a ditch. Gas is going to be poured on them, and their bodies are going to be set on fire. Now the Russians will claim to recover Hitler's skull. They claim to have his skull in Russia now, but the point of it is the Germans utterly destroy him so they can't be displayed, I guess, or whatever. And I'm sure this is great for conspiracy theories, right? Like, he's in Argentina right now, I'm sure, right? So nonetheless, this was fantastic news. And the German high command, at the time was the head of the Navy and the Army, are going to agree to surrender. Like as soon as Hitler kills himself, they're like, okay, this is stupid, we're done. And they surrender unconditionally. You understand? That means like whatever you say. So they are particularly afraid of the Russians. They know the Germans know what they've done to the Russians, and they're afraid that if they don't surrender to the Allies, i.e., British and Americans, then the Russians will take them, and then that who knows what will happen, right? So, and by the way, the ones who do surrender in the east to Russia, most of them don't survive. They end up in gulags or worse. So that was not who you wanted to surrender to. So this is an enormously momentous moment. We call it in history VE Day, the Victory in Europe Day. Okay, here you see Queen Elizabeth, right there, the current Queen Elizabeth. The one we have right now. She's here. She was Princess Elizabeth at the time. There's King George VI, her daddy. It is crazy, right? Like the current queen she's in this old picture. Huh? No, she's not married yet in this picture. I don't think they've gotten married yet. She's in the military uniform here. But the guy right there is King George VI, who was her father and really a good king, by all accounts. He was the one whose brother was king and quit so he could marry an American woman. The government and the British monarchy are like, hey, you can't marry an American divorcee. Like that's not how it works. And it's kind of similar, I guess, in a way to what's happening right now, with Prince Harry. We're not royal anymore. So yeah, he was the stuttering king. You remember, this is the king who had a really serious speech impediment. and the one who ate a hot dog in New York, for the very first time. So yeah, that's a big deal. I don't want to downplay that. Not anticlimactic. So I told you President Truman immediately kind of had to deal with some stuff. Not quite immediately, 3 months later. But the war in Europe is over. And that means we now need to meet again, right? And I told you this will be the 4th meeting of the Allied leaders. But this time, it's a newly constituted Big Three. Churchill was supposed to go to this, and then you have the most amazing event in politics happen. Churchill's party is voted out of office. And I know that sounds awful, but the problem is Churchill was a conservative, and the British people believed that that's what was needed for the war. But for the peace, they wanted, liberals. They wanted Labor and Liberal Party leaders to run. And so the Liberal Party leader takes over, and his name is Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee. He's the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. Churchill's actually voted out while he's at Potsdam, believe it or not. So at the end, Clement Attlee will be the negotiator. Truman, obviously the American president, and Stalin is still Stalin. He'll still be there for another 10 years. All right. And so at this meeting, Truman gets a telegram, secret code and telegram that says the baby is born. The baby is born. And that was code for the atom bomb worked. They had tested the atom bomb and it had worked in New Mexico. And so that's when, by the way, we had not told the Soviets we were developing an atom bomb at all. We told the Brits. The Brits were aware of it, but the Russians had no idea that this was happening. And so at Potsdam, we announced if the Japanese do not surrender unconditionally, they will be annihilated. Stalin agrees that the Russians will enter the war against Japan on a date. They give a predetermined date, right? And I'll tell you what that is in a second. And they agree that Germany will be cut up into different zones after World War II to be reconstructed. Think about like the military occupation of the South during Reconstruction, same kind of principle. Poland, unfortunately, will lose some of its territory to the Soviet Union. More importantly, there is no concession by Stalin to leave Eastern Europe. He sort of insinuates that they'll allow democratic elections. Yes, of course we'll allow elections, but these will not be democratic. They will not be the kind of elections that, like good guys win. So, by the way, Stalin thought he would be able to push Truman around, and Truman made sure that that wasn't the case. And this is going to be the second meeting, so to speak, of the Cold War, but it's also going to be the beginning of the great debate about the atom bomb. And your textbook actually does a very good job of explaining the debate over the atom bomb. It's on the varying viewpoints. If you ever want to read what might be a DBQ, flip through the varying viewpoints, because they are the biggest arguments of American history. These are at the end of the chapter. They say, the atomic bombs, were they justified? Varying viewpoints. So it's like the argument of history. And I've read the most recent big biography or big history of the development of the atom bomb, and by a guy named Richard Rhodes. It's a really good book. But it lays out, the atom bomb's development was at the time a weapon. That's all the planning was. Like it's a weapon. And so when we find out that it works, that's just another weapon. It's a weapon in our arsenal. And so the thing that develops the atom bomb is called the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project is interesting to me because if you've ever wondered what a mathematician and a physicist can do, well, they can do this. All right. So it starts at universities like Columbia, University of Chicago. They actually are researching the possibility of nuclear fission. Right. Is it even like doable? And they're going through what uranium can do. And so they finally tested it in a theoretical environment, in Chicago. And it seems theoretically that it should work. So they transport the entire group, all the scholars and fakers and engineers, to a secret base in New Mexico called Los Alamos. All right. And at Los Alamos, by the way, this is where the Russians start spying on us. So the Russian secrets, like getting American secrets, is at this place first. It's run by the Army. This guy, Leslie Groves, is in charge of it. But it's also run by a scientist. Robert Oppenheimer will be the head physicist on the project. And so these two are overseeing tons of military personnel and scientists and mathematicians and physicists. And when the bomb blows up, it's interesting to me. Oppenheimer quotes the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu scriptures. He says, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Because they had no idea what the chain reaction would look like. Some people thought they would set the world on fire, like the air literally on fire. Like they didn't know. So when the first atom bomb, test bomb was worked, Truman finds this out. And so we tell the Japanese, surrender or face total annihilation. And of course, if you hear that, you're like, oh, yeah, bring it on kind of thing. I mean, the Japanese, by the way, actually don't say that. The Japanese have actually started sending out surrender ideas through the Russians. Like, what is surrender going to look like? And we keep saying unconditional is what it's going to look like. Like you're going to surrender completely or be annihilated. So they haven't surrendered yet. And so that will bring us to this event. So what you're looking at here are the first two atom bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, right? And they were massive bombs, and they will be delivered. The first one will be delivered to the island of Tinian. Tinian is a small island in the Pacific. This was top secret. One of the interesting things about this story is the vessel that carried the atom bomb to Tinian is called the USS Indianapolis, right? Indianapolis, after it delivered the bomb, which was top secret, it was sailing away and it got sunk by a Japanese submarine. The Indianapolis did. And when it went in the water, it became, over 2 days, nobody knew where it was because it was top secret, right? So over a 2-day period, almost half the crew were devoured by sharks. So it's the worst single shark attack in history, of the crew of the Indianapolis. It's featured even in the movie Jaws, where the Robert Shaw character he's showing various shark attacks to the other character, and one of them is a tattoo, and he says, "Yeah, it's from the Indianapolis," and you get that moment of chill because you're like, "Oh, well, this is a situation where people were bobbing in the water, and they were holding onto each other and pounding the water, and the sharks would come up and eat the bottom of it, and like they would end up floating bottoms up, kind of. It's terrible. Like hundreds of sailors got killed by shark attack. After that, the Navy invested a lot of money in shark repellent. Like, how do you keep sharks away from shipwrecks? So anyway, that's the bomb's delivery. Now let's talk about the dropping of the bomb. So the ship, or the plane rather, that carries the atom bomb is called the Enola Gay. That's Colonel Tibbets, the captain of the airplane's mom. So he puts his mom's name on the plane, and they're given the delivery of the first atom bomb, and it enters nuclear war. And so the site that is chosen is a relatively solid military target. Hiroshima is a industrial city. It had not been obliterated completely by fire bombings. We'd already warned the Japanese cities to evacuate or we'd blow them up, And so we dropped this, and in the immediate fire that comes from the eruption of the bomb, 70,000 people are vaporized. You're talking about instant kill, And hundreds of thousands of people later will get radiation sickness and die of cancer from it. So this is an absolutely devastating weapon, right? And it's August 6th. The Japanese don't surrender on August 7th. This is a watch that was recovered from Hiroshima, and that was the moment the bomb exploded, froze it forever in time. There were people who were vaporized, and their shadows were black printed onto the walls of their house. So in other words, like it photo, how a photo effect where your eyes are bright and it hurts your eyes. The photo effect from the bomb was so bright that it basically flashed heat and it put your shadow behind you on the wall, and your body was vaporized. So there's like a literal, you could find where people's shadows were on the wall, but they weren't there anymore. So instant inferno. And take a look at what it did to the city. I mean, that you can see the city blocks here, right? Like those were structures in all those squares, but they didn't surrender. So 3 days later, by the way, the Russians come into the war on August the 8th. All right, so they declare war on Japan and invade North Korea. So that's why North Korea is communist. If you ever wondered, it's because of this moment in history when the Russians, that's where the Japanese were, that's where they attack them, that's where they stay at the end of the war, that's where they help prop up communism. Okay. Well, when we were negotiating, we didn't know that we were going to get the atom bomb in time to use it without the Russians. Yeah, you're right. Like long term, it would be great. But the question that often is raised about this second one: why drop another one? And there's a great debate about it. Some people say, "Oh shoot, I got to finish up." So anyway, this is what radiation sickness looks like. This woman's print of her kimono is baked into her skin. It's like a permanent tattoo. So it's a very terribly destructive weapon, the atomic age. And with that, after the second bomb, the Japanese are like, oh my gosh, they might have 100 of these things. See, we think that the Japanese thought we only had one. And Harry Truman later in history was asked, do you regret it all using the atom bomb? I didn't lose a sleep over. you know, because I've actually talked to soldiers, to veterans who say Harry Truman saved my life because they were in Europe and they were getting ready to be relocated to the Pacific to have to invade Japan. And they knew they would probably get killed in trying to invade the home island of Japan. The atom bomb took that out of the equation. And Truman always argued that he did it to save Americans and really Japanese people's lives. Because what this does is it ends the war. If you're the Japanese, surrender isn't shameful. Surrender is avoiding annihilation. Like you get to vaporize. So they meet, and here you can see the signatories on the USS Missouri. And after the surrender, you know, MacArthur is going to preside over this. And here you have this very famous picture. I don't know all the details of this picture. You know, and it's one of those things where I hope these two people know each other. I don't think this guy just grabbed his random girl, assaulted her. You know, like if that's the case, it takes a whole new meaning. But no, it just shows you the celebration. People are like, woo, you know, partying. This was happiness because the war was over. But I want you to keep in mind, and this is why World War II is so relevant. 75 million people died in World War II. That's a catastrophic figure. 75 million. And that's a fourth of America today. Most of them were civilians. Now, many of them died in the Holocaust, tragically. Many of them died as Russians, right? And so I have here the Russian numbers, too, to think about. So here's all the different countries' numbers, okay? And battle, by the way, casualties includes both killed and wounded. So some people don't realize that it's both. So if you're a casualty, that can mean wounds and killed. So if you look down here, you can see the Soviets had 14 million people dead, at least. Not even sure. The number's really impossible to calculate. We, you know, relatively small numbers compared to some of the other big fighters, but still, battle deaths, almost 300,000. One of the most costly wars in American history. But what's interesting to me, oh, by the way, lots of people forced out of their homes, relocated. Even if you weren't killed, you were homeless. Of course, you know, 14 million more Jewish people who are now homeless. Two major superpowers emerged. Obviously, one is a lot cooler than the other. But you know, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to be the big two after this. We actually emerged better off than we were before World War II. We're stronger. We're really the lone major economy in the world. We're going to put both the Germans and the Japanese on trial for atrocities. I'll talk about the German trials in the next chapter more at Nuremberg. But we're going to put Tojo to death. You know, the guy who planned the Japanese military conquest of the world. You know, and he'll be hung. And this will create, like World War I did, a lot of heroes. Out of this will come a whole host of American presidents. In fact, for the next half century, when you run for office, what did you do during World War II? It's going to be kind of the question. You know? Most notably, John Kennedy will be a major hero in the naval war in the Pacific. And that's, in closure, that's the World War II memorial. So I'll put up the quiz for today, and we'll start a new unit, our new chapter tomorrow. So have a great day, everybody.
Get going.